So my name is Meghan Dove. I work as a UX consultant for startups. I run a web and graphic design company and also have a full-time job as a UX UI lead at an IT consulting company. So I'm busy. I've worked at 2 startups in the past year that are using artificial intelligence to improve their industries, and I'm also working with 2 more right now that are in the pre-launch phase. Before we get started, I want to let you know that this is not a technical talk. I am UI UX. I can do some code, but it's not a data science talk. This is going to be an attempt to frame some potential issues and to give some suggestions to take action. I'm going to try and convince you that women in technology and that everybody in technology have a responsibility to educate people who know less about them, about artificial intelligence and machine learning. I think it is necessary for all of us to implicate ourselves to ensure that people, their data security, their human rights, and their freedom of expression are considered when mathematical models are applied to decisions that affect human beings. So as members of the tech industry, we have a biased view of how people interact with our products. I'm sure everyone in this room has somebody who, in their family, who calls them regularly. It's what? See, that's why I asked if you could hear me. Yeah? Haha, now you can hear me. So that's what I was wondering. So I'm sure that everybody in this room has somebody in their family that calls them regularly for tech help, who has no idea what's going on in their computers. But it's not just your old aunties that don't understand. In their 2019 report on the state of artificial intelligence, the venture capital firm MMC reported that 1 in 6 companies in the European Union were listing artificial intelligence as a key factor of their business. But when they looked at it more closely, out of 3,000 companies, about 40% of those didn't actually show any evidence of the use of AI. Just because you use a chatbot does not make you an AI company. So founders of AI companies don't know what artificial intelligence is. So I recently visited my family in Scotland, and I stayed with my old aunt. And she's going to be so mad that I called her my old aunt. Anyways, she's 68 years old, and while I was there, I tried to help her with some computer problems. If you're wondering about the picture, I couldn't find a stock image of like a 68-year-old woman on a computer. So this is a Highland cow, if you're not Scottish. So my aunt had recently moved, and when she moved, she changed her address, and she also updated her email from the email that her browser or that her internet provider provided to her to Gmail. And she assumed that email worked the same as the post office. So she had created a new email address, and Google was going to tell everybody. So she could no longer access any of her services. She couldn't get into her banking, and she had no idea why, because she was like, but I updated it in one place. So we had to go back to her old email and figure out all the services that she was using. Took hours. I had to explain to her a bit how the internet worked, that she shouldn't have the same password for every one of her banks. And this was an eye-opener for me, because she doesn't understand how basic email works. So how can she possibly understand the implications of sharing personal information on social media, or using points cards to get a discount at the grocery store? In 2017, Pegasystems released a report based on interviews with about 6,000 individuals. And they asked, have you ever interacted with artificial intelligence technology? 34% of people said no, like never. 34% people thought they had never interacted at all. And the reality was that 84% of these people were using it regularly. Now, those numbers seemed a little bit crazy to me, so I put out a poll on Facebook in advance of this talk, and I asked my friends, hey, how do you interact with artificial intelligence? And a bigger number than I thought should have said they don't. And they said that on Facebook. And I expected them to know that in order to have seen my post on Facebook, it was courtesy of an algorithm, that by being on that platform, they were interacting with artificial intelligence, but they didn't know this. So, to tell you the truth, it kind of shocked me. And the number of people was so high that I started to question myself. And I was like, I don't think this is what it is, but maybe they're actually smarter than I think they are. And there's a bit of confusion over what is machine learning versus artificial intelligence or a straight-up algorithm. Maybe they're calling it something else. So I started to do a little bit of research between the difference between algorithms and AI and where that line is, and machine learning being a part of AI. And I'm going to admit something here that's kind of terrifying, and I'm going to try to define AI, which is even more terrifying to me. This is a woman tech makers conference. I work in IT. I do functional analysis for software. I do web development, UX, and UI design. My technical experience and expertise is, of course, a fraction of that of the engineers in the audience, but I think I'm fairly tech savvy. You know, I can do command prompt. Like, I know something about computers. And yet, trying to figure out exactly what artificial intelligence was to explain it to other people was a rabbit hole, because there's a mass of similar but contradictory, kind of the same, but you're not sure how to interpret it, definitions. So one person would say that artificial intelligence is anything that displays intelligent behavior, even if it's directly programmed by a human. Somebody else would say that it's not actually artificial intelligence unless it can develop itself. But then somebody else would say that the minute that it can develop itself, it's machine learning. But then doesn't that make all artificial intelligence machine learning? So then why do we use the term artificial intelligence? Why don't we just say machine learning? How do I explain this to my aunt? So for the sake of this talk, courtesy of Jason Mays and NVIDIA, artificial intelligence is human intelligence exhibited by machines. Now, I'm sure you all know artificial intelligence can be lumped into two buckets. Today, we generally have narrow AI, so a system that can do one or a few things better than humans and only has some parts of human intelligence. But general AI is more, what we think about when we're envisioning Terminator or C-3PO. Machine learning, then, is an approach to achieve artificial intelligence through systems that can learn from experience to find patterns in the set of data. So you train it, you give it all sorts of information, and then it can take that information, find patterns in it, and apply that to new things that it's never seen before. It seems straightforward, but it's not. And I'm almost positive that someone here is like, yeah, that's not what it is at all. I hope that's not true, but it's in my head it is. So I was right in being surprised that my friends, people who I consider modern, intelligent individuals, would say that they don't interact with AI, because they do, almost every day, several times a day, in so many different ways. Looking at this list, I can explain to them that they do, and that's cool. And they look at this list and they'd say, okay, AI isn't scary, It's the thing that makes all of the things that I do on the computer more convenient. And that's true. But AI is kind of scary. Machine learning is kind of scary. And there's things that we have to be aware of, and there's things that we need to educate just normal people on the street about. The fact that there's very little regulation of the collection, storage, preservation, and exchange of information collected about us as individuals, that's scary. The fact that there's little to no regulation or oversight of the algorithms that are impacting people's lives daily in ways that they're not even aware of, that's terrifying. Of course, when I bring this up to my friends, they have that amazing response that you usually hear when somebody's asking you to give up your privacy. Well, if you're not doing anything wrong, you've got nothing to worry about. The reason that we have to be activists fighting for ethical AI is because we have a lot to worry about, even if we're not doing anything wrong. We need enforceable regulation to ensure that no matter who is deciding what is right or wrong, people's rights and privacy is protected. To take it back to my recent trip to Scotland, as we were driving back to the airport, wasn't quite this bad, but there was a wall of cameras going into the parking station. And I mentioned it to my aunt, and she said, they don't bother me. I'm not doing anything wrong. Why would I be bothered? Now, the reason that she says this goes back to the email thing. She doesn't understand. She thinks if something went wrong in this parking lot, a person would sit down, pull out all the VHS tapes, and review them. In her head, that's what's happening. She doesn't understand that by driving in there, her face has been recognized and put into a system somewhere. They know she was there that day. She doesn't understand that the fact that I was in the car with her has clocked me, and that now that relationship between the two of us is recognized and recorded, likely. She doesn't understand that there is no regulation of how long that can be kept on for, or who it could be sold to. And she has no idea that deepfake technology could take a video of her face and make her say things that she never said. Of course, in the car, in the parking lot, I didn't explain this to her because it would overwhelm her. But I did ask her, how can you say it doesn't matter if you're not doing anything wrong? Because you don't know who's going to be deciding what's wrong in the future. What happens if the definition of wrong in society changes to something immoral? What if a president decides that people of a certain race are bad and uses those video cameras to round them up? What if the cameras that are already in place start getting used to give you a social score based on whether you jaywalked or whether you parked straight in that parking lot? What if that social score determines whether or not you're allowed to use public transit? Now, in all of those scenarios, it would be artificial intelligence that is deciding those things, that is recognizing you, and all of those scenarios, in one way or another, are already happening somewhere in the world. So, companies in the United States that monitor truck drivers, they don't just clock the speed of the trucks. They actually have cameras now pointed at the truck drivers' faces. And what this allows them to do, I mean, with today's technology, you can tell when somebody's stressed, what they're feeling, their emotional state, and it allows them to plan routes, it allows them to increase fuel efficiency. But if we take it a step further, this hasn't been done, but it could be. Imagine that you combine that video of somebody at work with information about what satellite radio they're listening to. And imagine, based on their reactions and their microexpressions, you can see when they react strongly to a particular politician or a policy. Or imagine you know what show they're listening to and they get aroused and you can figure out their sexual orientation. And imagine that that leads to them losing their job or being blacklisted. We've seen this before. We've seen McCarthyism. There's no regulation that says how long these things are going to be kept for or how they're going to be used. And that's terrifying. Even worse, Facebook uses machine learning for facial recognition. Now, Canada and the UK, or the EU, are the only two places where it is not default that they are allowed to identify you in pictures in which you are not tagged based on facial recognition. And they can do this to a room. So if I took a picture of you right now in the United States and posted it to Facebook, Facebook knows that you were there. But imagine that you were at a gay pride parade. Or imagine that you were in another country and you were wearing something inappropriate, and that could lead to you going to jail for 3 months to 3 years. Imagine that that video that was taken was used 5 years from now, when the law has changed, and something that wasn't illegal before is used against you in the future. This is problematic. If people understood the magnitude of the involvement of AI and the decisions that impact their lives, their education, and their finances, they might be a bit more concerned about the data they throw away on social media, and they might ask more questions about how decisions are made. We can see clearly when Mark Zuckerberg was brought in front of Congress that our politicians don't know what questions to ask. They don't know how social media works. They don't know what Facebook is. So how are these politicians going to ensure that we are protected? This is where the advocacy comes in. The general population doesn't know enough to be concerned about the way their data is being used, about the way that algorithms are impacting their lives. As members of the tech community, we need to help educate them. So all of those things there sounded fairly extreme, but there's other examples. And I know that most of you probably know these examples, but when you put it all together, it becomes something different. Because artificial intelligence can impact your search for a job. An example of this is Amazon's recruiting software, which they found after 3 years of trying to create it was biased. They used 10 years of data to train the AI to pick out the best candidates from a job, choose 5 people out of 100. But of course, those 10 years of data said that more men had been hired, obviously. Of course, they caught this, and they caught that the system was blacklisting people who went to all women's schools or who had women's chess club champion in their CVs. But the bias of the system actually went deeper than that, because what it was also doing is it favored candidates who described themselves using verbs more commonly found on male engineers' resumes. The bias of the system wasn't for the word woman. It preferred people who used terms like executed and captured. Now, unless you're looking very closely and you've got a big team looking at this and there's some kind of review, are you going to catch that? AI can also affect our application to schools. Post-secondary institutions now use neural networks to screen applicants. One of the ways that this can affect people, particularly in the United States, is they have a rating system in the States for universities. And one of the things that gives you points is how often you offer a position and how often you're rejected. Now, what they found that certain systems were doing is they would look at somebody's application and they'd say, they could get in anywhere. We're probably a second choice school. And it would decide to reject them before it got rejected so that their score doesn't go down. So they don't know whether this is your first choice school. They don't know if it's next to your mom's house, it would be cheaper, it would be more accessible for you. It just makes that assumption, and your future is determined based on faulty bias. E-scores as well. You know, our credit scores are highly regulated, what goes into them and who can access them. But now people are using proxies, and those things use things like our browser history, what we bought before, what our postal code is, what kind of car we drive. And all of this information is out there available for purchase. And you might think, oh yeah, no, but it's anonymized and we're working with metadata. There have been enough studies done that prove, given a week, all of that can be reversed. You can target individuals with enough metadata from enough sources. So, employment fit and review processes also have the potential to affect lives. As people in technology, this is something that particularly affects us. I spend my days in WeWork, and this company is testing thermal and motion detectors, also Bluetooth check-ins, and they just bought a company that tracks smartphones. So they acquired Euclid, and what they do is using Wi-Fi, whenever somebody enables Wi-Fi in the office, they track where they are in the office at all times. Now, right now, this is being used to make the space better. You know, if there's not a lot of people in a conference room, we can make it smaller. If there's a lot, we can make it bigger. The problem is the way that it could be used in the future. The problem is how long they're keeping that data for. The problem is whether or not they can resell it or use it for different things. And we're not asking those questions. It's not regulated right now. Machine learning is also streamlining the use of personality tests in hiring. DeepSense offers a zero-effort way of assessing candidates beyond their resume. Their website says in the past, 76% of 100-plus person companies would use personality fit assessments when they were interviewing someone. Okay, that's great. Now they step it up. Using only an email ID, they can evaluate generally expressed sentiment and exhibited mood. An algorithm measures dominance, influence, steadiness, calculativeness. You're also graded on the mood you express, extroversion, emotional stability, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. Great. So that's making a lot harder for people to get their foot in the door. The other danger there is, using these tests, it's illegal to discriminate against somebody based on a medical condition, like anxiety or depression. But these tests are potentially finding a way to circumvent that so you can discriminate against people anyway. Hiring managers have always discriminated, tried to evaluate people's personality. Universities have always been picky about who they let in. The difference with these algorithmic decisions is that there's a lot more data being used now, and it's kept forever, and there's no legislation of how it's traded between people. You used to fill in an application to the school, sent in an essay, they got your grades, but now they can filter candidates based on race, credit, and social history. You used to submit a CV and do an interview, and now companies can pay to research you and grade you on how many posts you make on Stack Overflow. That's public information, and somebody is tracking it. Or also, what manga chat room you hang out in after work. And this has been done. There are companies that are doing this, deciding what chat rooms you are in after work, and whether or not that makes you a better developer, and they found that it does. The other problem is that there's a lack of transparency. We don't know what information is being used to make decisions, and there's no regulation of how a lot of it is collected. So Amazon never used that biased algorithm, but if it was a smaller company, if it was a smaller team, and they had just spent 3 years on it, would they have put it on the market anyway? And if they had, was there any opportunity for anybody to say, wait a second, this is biased, you're not hiring any women? No. Right now, validation of mistakes made by artificial intelligence systems is voluntary. Unless the people who created the AI are keeping careful track of errors and training their system, you have a dangerous cycle of reinforcement of bias. So, of course, everybody in here is fairly technical. It's not always easy to monitor things in this way. Understanding why a neural network made a decision gets more difficult the more complex the information is, and oftentimes the more accurate that it is. And of course, companies aren't offering up their secret sauce. But even if they were, how are we going to analyze this? A good example is from the 90s when a computer program decided that patients with pneumonia and asthma have better outcomes for survival than people who don't have asthma. Now, it's the contrary. If you have asthma and pneumonia, you're at risk. And the doctors knew this, and they would bring them in immediately, and that is why they had a better success rate. But the machine detected this success rate and said, hey, it's cool, he's got asthma, he's protected from pneumonia, send him home. It saw a pattern, but it didn't ask why. And unless you're watching how those decisions are made, you don't know. These scientists actually had to use non-machine learning algorithms to approximate the decisions that had been made by the system in order to figure this out. So, another question is what data is used to train mathematical models in AI? Sometimes it's not the system that it's fault, sometimes it's the bias that we're feeding to it. So there are facial recognition systems in China and Australia. In Australia, the database includes government ID photos and allows law enforcement to identify people in real time. Again, no worries if you're not doing anything wrong. The United States does have the same, but they talk about it less. Even if this kind of mass surveillance doesn't scare you, the way that models and AR systems are trained and the patterns identified are problematic. So this image, which is really blurry, sorry, is from the Flickr 30K data set. And this is used to train neural networks. It's a massive number of photos, and the way that they've got the captions is through the Amazon Mechanical Turk. So people have looked at these photos and described them. The problem is that when this was analyzed, there are certain biases in what people were saying the pictures were of. There are unwarranted inferences of activity, ethnicity, event, goal, relation, status, occupation. So are we monitoring to see whether a mistake has been made? With the Flickr 30K dataset, women were assumed to be working for men. Men were assumed to be bosses. People who look Asian were automatically Chinese or Japanese. Black people, no matter where in the world, were African Americans. Babies, white babies, were babies. Everybody else was classified by race. So what we're doing is we're training systems to look at the world through a white North American standard. We're building in bias unless we're very careful, and nobody is making sure that we're being careful. So it's also been regularly documented that oftentimes the models being used reinforce discrimination. I've tried to keep this talk very open to the things that affect everybody in this room. But everything gets exponentially worse if you are a person of color, if you are from a lower economic bracket, if you have had any adversity in your life, if you have a poor family history. There's so many different variables, and it aggravates bias. Compass is used to determine in the United States whether criminals will reoffend. It's used in 13 states. And ProPublica found that if you're African American, Compass was 77% more likely to qualify you as a repeat offender. Forecast Plus allows schools to rank applicants based on geography, gender, ethnicity, field of study, academic standard, or any other criteria you desire. What does that have to do with my grades and my ability to learn? Bias against people with medical conditions, as I mentioned previously, from these personality tests exist, but nobody's aware of them because you're not told when you're rejected for a job, oh, sorry, your personality test suggests that maybe you have anxiety, and we'd rather pick the person who doesn't because we're concerned that it's going to affect your performance. Credit card checks are being used in hiring processes, and this discriminates against people from lower economic brackets because it's used as a proxy. If you pay your bills on time, obviously you're going to be on time every day for work, really? And ads also target people in need with false and overpriced promises. So private universities have actually been taken to court for targeting isolated, impatient individuals with low self-esteem who are stuck and unable to see and plan well for the future. And what they do when they find these desperate people is they make them pay more for education. They make them pay more for services, and they make them false promises because they're gullible and they need it. Women are minorities in technology, but we also have to recognize our privilege in working as a part of this industry and in having exposure to what we have. We have to recognize the knowledge that we have that others don't. We attend events like this in order to encourage more people to get involved. And I think that we also have to reach out to get even more people outside of our circle involved, be they male or female. We're living in the wild west of data collection, and it's us as members of the technological elite who can act as sheriffs. It's on us to protect people who don't know enough to protect themselves. Now, these are some great books you can read. And I'm going to post these slides, and there's a whole big list of websites that you can check out. Because this was a 25-minute talk, and there's only so much that can be covered. I really hope it wasn't too top level and that it reframed things just a little bit to make you think about what you already knew. Now, there's so much more. If I had 10 minutes more, I would go into the details about how artificial intelligence is being used to profile people to the detriment of racial minorities and the poor. The danger of autonomous weapons. Look up autonomous weapons. Whole different subject, whole different talk. The danger of mass surveillance and facial recognition. The terrifying ability of deepfake technology. Unfortunately, for now, our time is up. The thing I want to impart to you is that people are concerned about robots taking jobs in Skynet because they don't understand the state of AI today. And this means that we're having all the wrong discussions. It's a vicious circle because as long as people remain ignorant about how their data feeds models and the decisions these models are making, they won't pressure companies and governments to take action to ensure that data and artificial intelligence is ethical. So the first step in being an activist and working to make AI ethical and to ensure equity is educating people about technology. So what can you do? The advocacy part of this talk, the equity part comes from us. Educate people who know less than you do. Encourage skepticism. Implicate yourself with organizations that advocate for ethics in AI. Be a part of the conversation. Be a part of the conversation for the people who don't know how to be a part of the conversation. Check out the Montreal AI Ethics Institute. They do monthly meetings, and they're doing some incredible things to get people engaged and talking about these issues. Encourage others to get involved. The only way to get protections put in place will be public pressure. Fight for accountability and transparency in the creation and implementation of AI systems. Finally, fight for more legislation like the GDPR, because data is part of the issue here. Protect human beings. As I said, there's going to be a huge list of resources. I'm going to post these on my website, and of course, all of these talks are recorded. Thank you very much.